Winston Churchill, a giant of history, famous for his inspiring leadership.
Advance, Britannia! Long live the cause of freedom!
But behind the legend lies a complicated character.
People tend to see Churchill the icon, Churchill the bulldog warrior, and of course, that's not the whole story.
He was an aristocrat and a man of the people.
It says a lot for his charisma and his humility that he was accepted and liked.
A trailblazer who also had questionable beliefs.
He is an old-school imperialist. He calls Indian people the dusky nation.
This is the story of the man behind the myth, using rarely seen footage, personal photographs, and told by those who knew him well.
When my grandfather was at home, everything revolved around him. It seemed to be a natural way of life.
This is the real Churchill. This time, we'll discover how Churchill tries to seal his place in history as Britain's greatest ever war leader.
Churchill sees this as being the role that he was born to perform.
From the powerful alliances he makes with Roosevelt and Stalin,
Churchill could be unbelievably charming and persuasive and persistent,
to the huge personal risks he takes
There is a real possibility that he might die.
for victory in the Second World War. It's Winston Churchill's second Christmas as Prime Minister, and he's just arrived in America. After more than 2 years of blackouts in Britain, the festive lights of Washington, D.C. are a welcome sight. But Churchill's not here on holiday. He's here to change the course of the Second World War. When it's announced Churchill's in town, it's like a movie star has arrived. An adoring American public sends him thousands of presents.
He received boxes of cigars. I mean, he couldn't possibly have smoked them all. He received this giant V sign in flowers. Churchill wasn't very tall. He was 5'6", and this V would have dwarfed him.
The way that Britain stood alone, with Churchill as its figurehead when they themselves remained in isolation, was something that most Americans greatly admired.
But there's one man Churchill needs to impress: President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Despite all the rhetoric of "we shall never surrender" and that the British would ultimately be victorious over Nazi Germany, Churchill really doesn't have much of a plan as to how he is going to be able to achieve victory without the United States.
Churchill has been invited to stay at the White House. It will be his home for the next 3 weeks.
He took one look at this room and said no, he didn't like it, and he just started wandering the halls of the White House trying to find a bedroom that he thought was more to his liking, much to the horror of the First Lady. Churchill, of course, eventually chose a bedroom that was directly opposite the president's, and he did so, of course, because he wanted to be as close as possible to Roosevelt.
Setting up camp as close to the president as possible is all part of Churchill's plan. He wants to get Roosevelt to back him in his struggle against the Nazis. He needs to act quickly. America is still reeling from the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor just 2 weeks ago. An attack that forced them to declare war on Japan and its ally Germany.
Churchill needs to ensure that the Americans, filled with rage about the Japanese surprise attack, are not going to pursue a war purely against Japan and leave Germany to a struggling Britain.
To do that, Churchill plans to begin by building a personal relationship with the president.
often think it's misunderstood how important personal chemistry is at this sort of very high-level diplomacy, and that's certainly the case here. And Churchill could be unbelievably charming and persuasive and persistent. And I think initially Roosevelt was slightly starstruck by Churchill.
Churchill insisted on setting up what he called his map room in the White House so he could track the course of the war. It had an immediate impact on Roosevelt, who set up his own map room, which eventually became the Situation Room in the White House, which is still there today.
Churchill wheels the wheelchair-bound president around the White House. They walk in and out of each other's bedrooms the whole time. They have conversations late into the night. At one stage, Roosevelt is wheeled into Churchill's quarters just as Churchill is emerging naked from his bathroom, and at least one account of it has him saying, "You see, Mr. President, the British Prime Minister has nothing to hide from the American President." And they genuinely began to like each other.
Having enjoyed Christmas dinner with the Roosevelts, on Boxing Day, Churchill makes his way to Capitol Hill. He's about to make what will be one of his most important speeches of the war. He's been invited to address a joint meeting of Congress.
There had only been 2 joint meetings of Congress ever in American history before Churchill spoke to them, so this is a massive honor.
There was a great deal of anticipation and excitement, and people were desperate to try to get into the Senate chamber to be able to listen to Churchill's speech. It was absolutely packed.
Churchill's chances of victory in Europe rest on what he says next.
After Pearl Harbor, there remains a strong section of American public opinion that does not want to see the United States embroiled in the war in Europe and believes that the proper response to Pearl Harbor should be a concentration on the war against Japan. So while there is huge interest in Churchill personally, he is aware that he doesn't yet have all of the United States public opinion behind him.
Churchill knows that popular support is critical if he's going to get the Americans to fully back Britain against the Nazis.
Members of the Senate and guests of the Senate, Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Right Honourable.
As Churchill approaches the microphones, his eyes fill with tears.
One of the interesting things about Churchill as a leader and as a public figure in this time is that he wasn't afraid or ashamed to show his emotions. This is a moment that he had been working towards and hoping for since he became Prime Minister in 1940.
Churchill's post-war secretary, Lady Williams, often saw his emotional side.
I remember he would sit there with tears pouring down his face, and he would say to me, "You've just got to get used to it, seeing a man cry."
I don't want to suggest that this was just purely image making because he didn't just summon up tears, but I think that the fact that he was seen to be deeply moved was something which was of benefit to his image.
Even though Churchill knows how much is riding on this speech, he begins with a joke.
Here I am, an Englishman, welcomed in your midst. Make this experience one of the most moving and thrilling in my life, which is already long and has not been entirely uneventful.
I think there's no doubt that Churchill relished the big occasions. This was someone who liked nothing better to be at the centre of events, and you don't get more central than this.
I wish indeed that my mother, whose memory I cherish across the veil of years, could have been here to see.
It's got all the hallmarks of a great Churchill speech. He talks of the ties of blood on his mother's side. His mother was an American heiress who came over and married a British aristocrat. So Churchill knows immediately that's how to plug into these people.
Churchill makes it clear that Britain and America share a common goal: a desire to do the right thing.
Here we are, together, facing a group of mighty foes who seek our ruin. Here we are, together, defending all that to free men is dear. What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
He was aware as an orator that you need your speech to build. You can see him playing with the audience, using his rhetorical tricks and building towards the climax.
Still I avow my hope and faith, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come, the British and American people will, for their own safety and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice, and in peace.
After just 30 minutes, Churchill has his audience in the palm of his hand.
The applause at the end of that speech is absolutely extraordinary. It goes on for minute after minute after minute. It's quite moving. It really gives one the sense that there's this special relationship between the United States and Great Britain that in many respects is still with us to this day.
A few days later, Churchill gets the best Christmas present of all. The Americans commit to backing him completely against Nazi Germany. Later that evening, Churchill is in his room at the White House.
Churchill is understandably elated, but he's also exhausted. A huge amount of physical effort goes into these orations.
He goes to open a window. Suddenly, he becomes short of breath. He feels pains in his chest.
The pressure that he's under is intense. He's also someone who doesn't live healthily. You know, he smokes all those cigars, he drinks champagne, he takes no exercise whatsoever.
Churchill calls his personal doctor, Lord Moran.
Lord Moran said to him, "These are signs of coronary insufficiency, and you've been overdoing things." Churchill replied to him instantly, "You're not going to tell me to rest. I can't. I won't. Nobody else can do this job."
Having achieved his mission, Churchill sets off on the journey home.
Britain was glad to have Winston Churchill back and grateful for the job he'd done.
Back in Britain, Churchill should now be taking it easy. But he doesn't. Instead, he sets off on another exhausting journey that he feels he has to make. And he's determined to do it, even if it kills him. It's 6 months since Winston Churchill's successful trip to Washington, D.C., and his relationship with President Roosevelt is going from strength to strength.
With Roosevelt, there was a genuine affection. And he says, "I love that man."
The American chiefs of staff have come to London to discuss how the two allies are going to take on Hitler together. After 3 years of war, most of Europe has fallen to the Nazis. France is under German control. The American generals want to liberate Europe by sending their troops into northern France as soon as possible.
They had argued that having entered the war and having agreed to fight in Europe, the most obvious thing to do is to launch an attack into France, and then moving on, if Adolf Hitler is in Berlin, that's where you should be going.
But Churchill is worried that sending British troops across the Channel into France now could end in disaster. This is the battleground where almost 1 million British soldiers died in the First World War, something that still haunts Churchill to this day.
He felt, having spent time on the Western Front in the First World War, and just seeing them stuck, pointlessly losing lives, made him realise it needed to be a cautious attack. You needed to be super ready.
Churchill believes the Allies need more time to prepare for an invasion on this scale.
He knows that it's going to take time to build up forces to launch an effective operation in Western Europe through France.
For now, Churchill would rather use American troops elsewhere. For the past 2 years, Britain has not only been at war with the Nazis in Europe, it's also been defending British colonial interests in North Africa from invading Nazis and Italian fascists. Churchill is determined not to lose control of his beloved colonies.
The war was about defeating the Nazis, but it was also about protecting the British Empire. And Churchill had empire riven through his soul.
He needs to convince the Americans to help in North Africa before any invasion of France. And Churchill has a secret weapon to win this argument: his newly built special relationship with President Roosevelt.
Roosevelt takes great risks to back Churchill. Roosevelt makes decisions in terms of how America will fight the Second World War that are completely counter to what those around him are saying the United States should do. And I think that's a great testimony to Churchill.
But Roosevelt isn't the only person Churchill needs to convince. Since Hitler invaded Russia in 1941, Britain has been allied with the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. Stalin is furious that his allies want to delay joining the fight in Europe, where his Red Army is struggling against the Nazis.
Russia feels they're bearing the brunt and are bleeding in their hundreds of thousands into their own soil.
Churchill needs the Russians to hold off the Nazis in the east. But he is not prepared to take the pressure off Stalin by taking on the Nazis in France just yet. It's critical that Churchill keeps the Russians on side.
Churchill understood that without the Russians, the possibility of winning the war seemed impossible.
Churchill cooks up a plan. He'll use his charm against Stalin. He sets off for Moscow to convince the Soviet leader that the delay is necessary. Having just recovered from a near heart attack 8 months earlier, the journey is fraught with danger.
You have to remember that if these planes go above a certain altitude, you have to have oxygen. And Churchill, of course, has his oxygen mask adapted so that he can smoke.
Churchill arrives at the Kremlin to see Stalin. Despite having been allies for 2 years, the two men have never met. Churchill's determined to make the right first impression.
Churchill, in lots of ways, was the consummate all-round diplomat. He was very sensitive. You notice a similarity between the way the two men are dressed. Churchill is in his siren suit. What he's trying to do is to tell Stalin that he is one of the people.
Now, admittedly, his siren suits were tailored and often made of velvet. They were a costume.
After the initial introductions, the two men sit down for formal discussions.
Stalin fronts up to him and goes, "What is it? Are you scared of the Germans? When are you going to fight them properly, like we are?"
And this really riles Churchill. And at one point, he's on the verge of walking out and going home.
But Churchill can't leave. He must get Stalin to sign up to his plan and commit Russian troops to continue fighting the Nazis, allowing the Allies to delay their invasion of France and instead focus on North Africa. so he sits up with the Soviet leader late into the night.
Churchill was somebody who enjoyed dinner party diplomacy. Stalin liked to have a drink, and Churchill was the same, albeit vintage champagne as opposed to vodka.
Churchill's ability to consume alcohol, it's something that binds them together.
As the drinks continue to flow, Churchill seizes his moment.
Churchill makes a passionate defence of his determination to fight the Germans in North Africa. It's said that the translator was so awestruck by the force of Churchill's rhetoric and the passion that he stops translating. Although Stalin isn't able to understand most of what Churchill is saying, it's Churchill's fighting spirit that comes through.
Churchill's passion wins the day. Stalin accepts there will be no immediate attack on the Nazis in France. Churchill leaves Moscow with what he came for, and a hangover. But he still celebrates with champagne on the flight home. Three months later, instead of invading France, British and American troops land on the east coast of North Africa in Operation Torch.
It is a hugely significant action. Churchill has managed to accomplish the thing that he's tried the hardest to do. He is the one who has argued that American troops would be best placed landing in North Africa. Torch demonstrates that it's his opinion, it's his argument that has won the day.
Churchill has an incredible amount personally invested in the success of this mission. His only son Randolph is among the troops.
As soon as the action starts, then he's going to be there in his map room, he's going to be calling key advisors, he's going to be issuing minutes and telegrams to the chiefs of staff.
The whole great show went like magic, and General Eisenhower himself has attributed much of the success to the assistance given by Britain's combined operations, and the training and planning by our combined operations was great work.
Churchill orders church bells across the nation to ring out for the first time in 2.5 years in celebration.
For Churchill himself, it is a moment of triumph. His strategy has been proven to have been correct.
His success is even sweeter when he receives a letter from his son telling him he is safe and well. Churchill tells his secretary, "Tonight there is sugar on the cake." Just weeks later, there's even more good news for Churchill. The Soviets at last have the German army on the back foot in the east.
The Russian ring closes round the 6th German Army at Stalingrad. The history of warfare has never known such an encirclement and annihilation of so large a number of regular troops.
With the tide of the war turning, Churchill heads to the Iranian capital Tehran for an historic event. The three Allied war leaders are all meeting together for the first time.
From the supreme headquarters of Britain, the United States and the USSR bring to the capital of Persia the leaders of the war against Germany.
Churchill believes in face-to-face diplomacy between world leaders. This is part of the role that he relishes. He believes that these are the moments where you are making history.
Top of the agenda is deciding a date for Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of Nazi-occupied northern France. An attack that will later become known as D-Day. It's an action Stalin has been demanding for years. There are rumors that if he doesn't get a commitment that D-Day will happen soon, he'll abandon the Allies and make a peace deal with Hitler. But Churchill wants to delay D-Day for as long as possible.
He fears that the only way that the Allies could now lose the war would be an unsuccessful invasion of the continent.
Churchill believes it will take 2 years to prepare for the invasion of northern France. That means delaying until 1945. Having got his way with both Roosevelt and Stalin before, he's confident he can get them to agree to his timetable.
Churchill sees himself as being the senior partner in this trio. He sees this as being the role that he was born to perform.
He sends a message to Roosevelt, who he regards as a friend. He asks to meet privately before the official talks begin.
Churchill expects Roosevelt to be on board. Roosevelt had always been very receptive to Churchill's thinking.
Roosevelt doesn't respond to his invitation.
Roosevelt was a better politician than Churchill in a way. He could be duplicitous when he wanted to be. He could be quite scheming. He could be ruthless. Churchill put a much higher value on friendship than Roosevelt did. Roosevelt just saw it as pure politics and what is best for what I want.
Having snubbed Churchill, Roosevelt then goes behind his back. He arranges a private meeting with Stalin, to which Churchill is not invited.
Roosevelt wants to develop a personal relationship with Stalin. Roosevelt recognizes that the Soviet Union is a power that is not going to disappear, and that if we're going to talk about maintaining world peace after the war, one of the critical factors in doing so is this relationship with the Soviets.
Soon after, the formal negotiations begin.
The dynamic between the big three at Tehran is really interesting. So you've got these three incredibly powerful individuals maneuvering around one another.
Stalin insists D-Day should take place in May 1944, just 6 months away.
Roosevelt is sitting in the room with Churchill and Stalin. He makes it a point to agree with Stalin that D-Day has to happen, and it has to happen in early May 1944.
Churchill tries to persuade them with his usual charm, but this time it doesn't work.
He'd become the half in an alliance of 2.5, the bit part player, the small one. Churchill clearly had an unrealistic belief in the impact of his own personality. No matter how many times you meet Roosevelt or try and build a personal relationship with the likes of Stalin, who actually is a deeply untrustworthy man, the agendas of the three countries were so very different.
Despite Churchill's best efforts, the date for D-Day is set for May 1944. Later that day, the three Allied war leaders pose for this photograph.
This is a very telling photograph. I think it kind of exemplifies the changed relationship between the three leaders and the three powers. When you look at Churchill, he looks like a man who is dejected. He's almost detached from the other two. Churchill was a very emotional man. He took these things to heart. The fact that Roosevelt was now wooing Stalin the same way that Churchill wooed Roosevelt in the early stages of the war really bruised Churchill's ego. Churchill found the whole experience at Tehran quite wounding.
Eight days later, Churchill arrives in Tunisia. With a date for D-Day now set, he wants to meet with the man who will lead the attack, American Supreme Commander General Eisenhower. Instead, Churchill wakes up with a temperature of 101 degrees. He's diagnosed with pneumonia. Then Churchill's heart starts showing signs of strain.
His doctor, Lord Moran, actually fears for his life. His wife, Clementine Churchill, is summoned to be at his bedside. There is a real possibility that he might die. What that illness represents is the huge stress and strain that he's been under.
Churchill is forced to take time out to recover. With one of the most important operations of the war just months away, Churchill's fears about being sidelined look like they're becoming a reality. Winston Churchill is heading for Southampton. The troops there are preparing for the most iconic moment of the Second World War, the D-Day landings.
There was a huge nervous tension for Churchill building about D-Day. And I think this had been building for some time, ever since the Tehran conference.
In just 4 days' time, British, Commonwealth and American troops will begin their invasion of German-occupied France. It's an operation that has been more than 6 months in the planning. The outcome will decide which side wins the Second World War. It could also be a pivotal moment in the relationship between the Allies. The Russians already have Germany on the run in the east. And soon, the number of American soldiers deployed will outnumber the British.
The reality is, as the war moves on, Churchill's position and power will start to dissipate and weaken.
He thinks, what's Britain got to offer? We don't have the troop numbers. We don't have the resources that these other two powers have. But we do have an incredibly charismatic leader who has credibility, who's held out and resisted and stayed in the war from the beginning. That's Churchill himself.
His wife, Clementine Churchill, described him as an egoist. There is a vanity there.
Churchill believes he's found a way to stamp his personality on D-Day and make it seem like a British victory. He will lead the attack from the front.
These plans would have seen the Prime Minister, he would have crossed the Channel on HMS Belfast and then transferred to a destroyer. And then landed on the beaches on D-Day itself.
No one else thinks Churchill's plan is a good idea. Especially General Eisenhower, the American in charge of the whole operation.
The last thing Eisenhower or any of the military commanders want is Churchill anywhere near the front on D-Day itself. It would be a huge added burden and risk.
But they can't stop him.
The only person under the British Constitution who can order Churchill not to go is the King. And the interesting thing there is that even then, it takes 2 handwritten letters from the King before Churchill finally and grudgingly admits that he has to respect the King's wishes and can't go.
It's not his turn to be in the limelight in that moment. This is about the men on the beaches, and it would have been thoroughly irresponsible.
Less than 24 hours before D-Day, Churchill heads back to Downing Street. All he can do now is wait and watch from the sidelines.
He said to his wife, Clementine, you do realise that by this time tomorrow morning, 10,000 men may have been killed. You can see how much it would have been preying on his mind.
The next morning, the D-Day landings begin. 160,000 British, Commonwealth and American soldiers are put ashore on 5 beaches in Normandy. It's the first time British troops have successfully engaged the Germans on French soil in 4 years.
Everything went like clockwork, and that's saying something when you consider the size and complication of the plan to liberate Europe. This was the climax of months of intensive work. For this was D-Day.
It's 6 days later. More than 300,000 Allied troops have landed in France and have liberated a stretch of coast 50 miles long. With the landing zone considered safe, Churchill at last gets his chance to cross the Channel. This photograph was taken of Churchill as he stepped ashore in France.
This is one of Churchill's happiest moments of the wartime experience. He looks extremely contented. He looks as if this is the place that he, in his mind, is very much meant to be, and that is going into harm's way, potentially, going to where the fight is taking place.
Churchill is met by British Commander Field Marshal Montgomery, who drives him 5 miles inland to his headquarters. It's the first time he's travelled through France since it fell to the Nazis 4 years earlier.
The return to France is a hugely significant moment for Churchill. The first few weeks of his premiership in 1940 had been dominated by the fall of France. The return to France brings things full circle.
He's feted in the streets by the French people. You know, this is Churchill. This is the man who has told them that Britain will not forget them and that Britain will come back and will liberate them. And here he is now, and it moves him deeply. The fascination that exists today with Churchill existed then as well. The force of personality that exists and the impact that he has on a nation.
This isn't enough for Churchill. He can see the smoke from the front line just a few miles away and wants to see the action. But no one will let him get any closer.
He was indignant that during his visit he'd actually not seen any fighting. He had not personally felt himself in danger. There were so many times in his life where Churchill put himself in harm's way in pursuit of what could be described as a surge of excitement, a rush of adrenaline, what he called daring do.
Later that day, crossing the Channel home, Churchill asked the captain of his ship to open fire on German positions. The captain agrees to his request. Churchill compliments him on his sporting spirit.
There's this huge part of Churchill, even though it's in a sort of 70-year-old body by this stage, that, wants to be a soldier.
Churchill loved nothing more to be in the thick of the action, and he would have relished the end of that long day, which saw him on board a British warship firing the guns at the enemy.
Churchill's had a taste of the action, but it's not enough. Next time, he'll make sure nothing stops him from getting to the front line. Winston Churchill has just arrived in the Netherlands. He's hot on the heels of British, Commonwealth and American forces who have fought their way to the River Rhine. Having been prevented from being part of D-Day, Churchill isn't going to miss out on the moment British troops enter the heartlands of Germany.
Churchill sees this as being the finale. This is the final push across this last barrier that he recognises as being the defensive position that Germany's relied upon throughout its history, and the last time an invading army had actually crossed the Rhine by boat was Napoleon.
The King noted in his diary, Churchill was utterly determined to be part of it. He's very restless nowadays and cannot bear to be out of things.
But Churchill doesn't just want to witness this historic moment. He needs to make his presence felt.
He has a hard time accepting that Britain is playing a junior role now in this great struggle against the Axis. And part of the way he can make up for that is to go to the battlefield.
He borrows a plane to get a look at the front from the air. Flying at just 500 feet, he could be brought down by a slingshot.
Churchill's like a kind of child in a sweet shop. He's going to want the biggest piece of bubble gum. He's going to want to be right there where the action is. He's just such a giant ego.
He romanticised the idea of dying in battle, and possibly thought that if he were to die after this supreme struggle which he had led Britain through so successfully, this would be a rather fitting end to his life, almost like Nelson dying at the Battle of Trafalgar.
When he returns to HQ, Churchill discovers his private secretary covered in blood. A shell exploded just meters away from his jeep. Churchill tells him, "I'm jealous." The Prime Minister goes to bed determined that tomorrow, nothing will stop him from getting to the front line. The next morning, Churchill heads straight for the banks of the River Rhine. Here, he meets American Commander General Eisenhower.
He has a great line for him. He says, "My dear General, the German is whipped. We've got him. He is all through." He looks sprightly. He looks energised. He looks a man in his element.
Churchill insists on going to the most shelled bit of the bank. And that is, of course, a massive headache. It's not going to look too good for the military command if they lose Britain's key figurehead. And apparently he says, "Well, I'm an old man and I've worked hard. Why shouldn't I have a little fun?"
And that's exactly what Churchill intends to do.
Churchill actually notices a motor launch that's parked on the river and suggests to Montgomery that they jump in and head across. And Montgomery very happily says, "Sure, why not?"
It's at this moment that Churchill appears to be those two almost contradictory parts of his character, both supreme war leader and naughty schoolboy.
Churchill is now crossing the 400 yards of the River Rhine, headed for the heart of enemy territory.
He is clearly delighted. Germany really was Hitler's fortress, the Reich which had meant to last for 1,000 years. And here is Churchill entering the fortress.
Churchill knows that even in this moment, he's reliant on the support of his allies.
Just check in the motorboat how many men are chewing gum. Most of those men surrounding Churchill are Americans. And that really is this kind of subliminal message about where the power really lay. It lies with America and with Russia. And that's the future.
This is Churchill's attempt to make up for that loss of power.
He puts himself very deliberately at the heart of the story. He is sort of instinctively aware of where the cameras are. He is aware of the impact of his own appearance.
You have to ask at this point, why was our Prime Minister in a military uniform? This constant cigar that he waggles about and plays with and fiddles with and puffs on. I refuse to believe he was that dependent on nicotine. He was a man who understood the power of the prop. The cigar, I think, made him greater than the sum of his parts, and he knew it. Imagine Churchill without the cigar and the costume. He's a slightly undersized bald man of 70.
On the eastern bank of the Rhine, Churchill takes in his defeated enemy.
This was still the front line of the war, filled with danger. There are snipers all around in front of him, and at that moment, shells began to hit. The general explains that he can no longer accept responsibility for Churchill being there and that he must leave. The look on Winston's face was just like that of a small boy being called away from his sandcastles on the beach by his nurse. It was a sad wrench for him. He was enjoying himself immensely.
This crossing of the Rhine is incredibly emotional for him. It's a tremendous moment of history, and he recognizes that.
When he went to inspect the bomb damage during the Blitz, he famously promised the people who were standing amongst the rubble and the ruins that he would give it them back. As he crossed the Rhine, he would have seen that moment as a fulfillment of that promise.
Churchill could sense that all his hard work was finally paying off. Just days after he became Prime Minister, he pledged he would give his blood, his toil, and tears and sweat. And that's what it's taken to get to the stage where victory's just a few weeks away.
Next time, having won the war, Churchill asks voters for another 5 years at number 10.
He's absolutely desperate to carry on and doesn't believe that anyone could do what he could do.
He calls a general election, expecting to win.
It never crossed their mind that the election was going to be lost.
But Churchill is in for a shock.
And Churchill, Fallen Hero is brand new next Friday night at 9. It's always been an intriguing and mysterious relationship. The Queen versus number 10. Behind Closed Doors is streaming now on My5 and new next. Dance to the hits of 86, when the mullet was a choice, not a lockdown necessity. Britain's favourite 80s pop songs features classics and a few you'll never forget in just a mo.